Hey, hope everybody's having a good day. Sitting around here watching some football this weekend. I know a lot of you guys are not into the sports ball so much, but should be some good games on today. Just saw a crazy catch by Buffalo. Anyway, I've been thinking a lot this week about something called cognitive bias. A couple of things kind of sparked my thinking on this. The first was met with my guitar teacher last weekend, and he pointed out and kind of criticized the fact that for 3 consecutive lessons, I had been playing 3 different guitars. Um, and his suggestion was that I pick one guitar and play it exclusively for a while because there is an adjustment curve every time I pick up a different guitar. And so he wanted me to play a consistent guitar for a while. So that got me to thinking, okay, if I've got to pick one of these guitars to play with, what am I going to choose? We'll get to what I chose and why a little bit later. But the other thing, it's kind of related to cognitive bias. I'm sure some of you have seen lately. There's been some back and forth on YouTube. People talking shit about vintage guitars and other people talking shit about the people that are talking shit about vintage guitars. It's kind of fun to watch. Hell, I've never played a vintage guitar, so there's no room for me in that conversation. It would be kind of ridiculous for me to say that this 2023 Les Paul is just as good as something that I've never even had my hands on. I don't know. So that got me to thinking a little bit about cognitive bias and why do we like the things we like? Why do I like a Gibson Les Paul? Do I have a cognitive bias towards this Gibson on the headstock? Absolutely. There's probably some objective, realistic reasons as well that I would prefer a Gibson Les Paul over, say, an Epiphone Les Paul or another Les Paul. Like it or not, the finish makes a difference. More the thickness of the finish makes a difference on how the guitar resonates in your hands and feels. That's beside the point. I don't want to get into all that, the tone wood nonsense and everything else. Everything affects the way a guitar feels and the way it plays, therefore affecting the way it sounds. But that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about our expectations and our beliefs. And sometimes those expectations and beliefs are based more around an ideal and fantasy than they are reality. So when I think about a Les Paul, who comes to mind? What do I associate a Les Paul with? Jimmy Page, Slash, Billy Gibbons, Zakk Wylde, Gary Moore, and then of course Les Paul. You can't really leave out Les Paul. A lot of other people. Who do you associate this guitar with when you think about this guitar in your mind? Who are some famous Strat players? Let's grab a Strat. Who do we think of when we see that classic headstock, that 3 single coil pickup? Eric Clapton, Hendrix, David Gilmour, Jeff Beck, Eric Johnson. Hundreds of other people have played a Strat. Mark Knopfler. Knopfler didn't exclusively play a Strat, but that red Strat is kind of iconic. Rory Gallagher, I think, was a kind of a famous Strat player. Is a Strat a good guitar? Yeah, but I think more than anything, it's who we associate in the music that we associate in our minds with the Strat that cause some people to have a preference for the Strat. Are there, I'm kind of getting out of order here. This is my ADH brain kicking in. all of these guitars probably have some limitations. These single coil pickups on a Strat have a very unique sound, but they also provide a lot of limitations in what you can produce and how you produce it. The trem is really cool for people that utilize it and for songs that utilize it, but it creates some limitations in tuning stability on the guitar, which is why a lot of people get a Strat and then block the trem first thing. That's why a lot of people have gone to a humbucker in the bridge position to try to compensate for some of the limitations of a single coil. So Strats are great guitars. But more than anything, we associate in our minds beliefs and expectations about the guitar. So let's talk about cognitive bias. Cognitive bias is a systematic error in thinking that affects how we process information, how we perceive things, and ultimately how we make decisions. It's not necessarily a bad thing. It's a part of human nature. We develop biases a lot of times based on real life experiences. If you see Fred get bit by a snake and die, you're going to have a cognitive bias against things that are snake-like in appearance, and that could protect you. But it could also lead to some irrational beliefs and reactions that could be avoidable. So let's talk about two different types of cognitive biases. We have conscious biases and we have unconscious bias. Conscious bias is explicit, it's intentional. You are aware of the attitudes and beliefs that you have about this, and so the behaviors that come from them are intentional. So let's say you have a bias against guitars made in China. You are aware of this bias. Maybe the bias is based on you believe that some Chinese manufacturers use unfair labor practices. They exploit their workers. They're using government subsidies to undercut guitar prices of other manufacturers. Those are all possibly intentional and explicit cognitive biases that aren't necessarily wrong or bad, but they're there. Does that mean that every guitar made in China is bad? Absolutely not. But we can have biases. The unconscious bias is the harder ones because we're not aware of them. They're often intentional and they can affect our behavior. We can't completely eliminate cognitive biases. They are just part of who we are. They're hardwired into our brain. And so if you can't get rid of them, at least you can learn to recognize them and kind of moderate their effects, not let them control us completely. The first step is awareness, just knowing that you've got the biases. So you can pay attention to them and be on the lookout for if you're thinking doesn't seem to fit rational, logical thought. What other types of guitars do we associate? I mean, for years and years, this screamed country music. There are a lot of people who play rock and jazz that use and have used a Telecaster, but in our minds, who are some of the most famous Telecaster players? Brent Mason. Who else? Waylon Jennings was a famous Tele player. Lots of country artists. Brad Paisley, kind of a well-known country Telecaster player. But Keith Richards plays a Tele. Jimmy Page played a Tele, I think, exclusively on the Led Zeppelin 1 album. Julian Lodge, who I think I mentioned earlier, jazz player, plays a Tele. Telecasters have seemed to have a resurgence in the last few years of popularity. A lot of people playing Telecasters that previously wouldn't have. I'll be honest, when I was growing up, I thought that headstock was the ugliest thing I'd ever seen. I always thought I wouldn't mind having a Telecaster, but I would like to have a Strat headstock on it. And now that I'm a little older and a little wiser, I've come to appreciate and like the little skinny Telecaster headstock. How do those associations affect our opinion or feelings about the instrument? And I would suggest that it's a lot. It's a lot more than most of us are aware of. That we like a lot of the things that we like because of what we associate those things with. We are drawn to, or not so much anymore. In fact, I've heard they're almost impossible to get rid of. When I was a kid, Marshall Stack was the be all end all. I mean, that was the rock and roll dream, was to have a full stack. Nobody's playing through a full stack anymore that I'm aware of. We're shifting towards smaller amps, more portable amps. I play with this Princeton Reverb here in my living room. I love it. I love it in part because of what I associate it with and who I associate it with. The Fender name means a lot to a lot of people, whether they realize it or not. Having those tubes in there, I know there's a different sound quality from a tube amp to a modeler. I don't know that it can't be. I don't know that there cannot be a difference. There's always going to be a difference. What I'm saying is that our expectations and our beliefs affect our decisions and our judgment probably more than reality. There are people that are never going to play through a tube amp, or that's fine. They don't want one. They don't need one. There are people that are never going to give up their tube amps and switch to Marshall or modelers. That's fine. They don't have to. I'm just saying, be aware how much our cognitive biases affect those decisions, because they do a lot. So what's another guitar? 335. Who do you associate with the Gibson semi-hollow style guitars? Some of the early blues players come to mind. Famous SG players. Who do you associate with an SG? My first thing that pops into my head is Angus Young. Growing up, that was AC/DC Back in Black was like the rock album when I was a kid. Tommy Iommi, Dickie Betts from the Allman Brothers, who are some other famous SG players. So we associate those guitars with the people and the music that we love, and that drives a lot of what we like and why we like it. How much does the Fender name matter on the headstock? And why does it matter? If it really matters at all, it's because of our cognitive biases and or the resale value. My favorite Telecaster doesn't have a decal at all on the headstock. It's a guitar that I put together with parts from manufacturers that I know and trust, and it's got a great neck. It's got a great sound. Doesn't have a name on it. As far as enjoyment in playing, it's probably my favorite Telecaster. But I'm still drawn to that spaghetti logo. So that leads me back to trying to pick one guitar to play for a period of time. And as I got to thinking about, do I want to play a Les Paul style? Well, I wouldn't mind that. And if that's all I had, I'd play it and I'd love it. I like the fingerboard radius. I like the way the neck feels. It's heavy as hell. It's 9 pounds. There's no belly carve. There's no contours on that body. It's not very comfortable. What about a Telecaster? I've got some Tellies. I've got a Telly with a little 59 in the bridge and a humbucker in the neck. I added an arm carve and a belly cut. That was a real contender for the one guitar that I'm going to play for the next month or two. I like it. It's got a 42 millimeter nut and a 9.5 inch radius. And that's perfectly playable. And once you adapt to it, there's absolutely nothing wrong with it. But I know for me, a little bit wider of a neck and a flatter radius is just easier for me to play. And so I got to thinking about all my guitars, and this was the one I settled on. And it's a Yamaha Revstar Standard. It's got a real comfortable neck. It's got a 12-inch radius, stainless steel frets. It's got some nice contours on the body, so it's comfortable to hold. It's 7 pounds, 14 ounces, so it's not as heavy as my Les Paul. It's not as light as my Tele. Just a good all-around guitar. And that got me to thinking about the cognitive bias part. Who do I associate this guitar with? Nobody. I don't know that I've ever seen anybody professionally playing this guitar. And that affects the way we view the guitars. That affects the way we think about them. It affects our emotional response to the guitars. So if we can take our emotional responses out, what decisions would we make? And I'm not suggesting we do that. I'm still going to love my Gibson Les Paul in large part because of those emotional responses, and that's okay. But I'm going to recognize that those are emotional responses. They're not based on objective reality. Are vintage guitars better than new guitars? Like I said, I don't know. There are things we could measure that are verifiable and measurable to decide whether this guitar sounds better than this guitar or whether this guitar plays better than this guitar. I'm sure there are ways to objectively measure it. I'm not aware of anybody that's ever done that. But it is annoying when people tell me, when you hear people say that there's no way those vintage guitars are any good when the vast majority of us have never seen, let alone touched, a 58 or a 59 Les Paul. I don't understand that line of thinking. And a lot of people are biased against guitars that cost a lot of money. They can't figure out why a Les Paul should cost $3,000. In spite of the fact that adjusted for inflation, Les Pauls are probably cheaper today than they were in 1958 or 1959. But their expectations are different. Once you buy a $200 guitar that plays really well, it's hard to wrap your mind around paying $3,000 for a guitar that plays very well because we've got that comparison bias. Anyway, that's my Psychology Sunday thoughts for the day. We're all affected by cognitive bias, and we shouldn't even try necessarily to get rid of it, but let's try to be aware of it and make logical, rational decisions that are impacted by cognitive bias as little as possible. And I didn't even bring this up. I will. I think the cognitive bias thing is why a lot of people don't like PRS guitars. They don't associate anybody with a PRS guitar. They don't have anybody in their just top of their mind that they say, hey, PRS. Maybe Carlos Santana is the one person that pops to mind. The other person I think of when I think about PRS guitars is Steve Lukather, who is probably not real well known to anyone except other guitar players that watch YouTube. And that makes me think that there's something to those guitars because people who their livelihood depends on what they're doing tend to make what I would say are better decisions about what they use and what they don't use because their livelihood depends on it. And if they've had success and some longevity in the field, they can't be too misguided by their own cognitive biases. They have to objectively look at what's going to work and what's going to do the job in order to survive as long as they have in the industry. So when you see somebody like Lukather playing a PRS guitar, you got to think maybe there's something to those guitars. Maybe there's a reason of all the guitars that he could choose to play, he's playing that specific guitar. Anyway, let me know what you think. What are your cognitive biases? Who do you associate, or what do you associate with certain guitars? I just know growing up, Jimmy Page with the Les Paul. That's the most classic connection in my mind that I can think of, was Jimmy Page with the Les Paul, Jimi Hendrix with the Strat, and then of course Eddie with what we would call a Super Strat. Those were the connections in my mind, and that's a lot of why I like the things that I like, is because of the music and the people that I associate with them. Hope you guys are having a good Sunday. Take care of yourselves. See you next time.